Mrs. CD had recently been divorced and needed to work to support her children as her husband refused to pay child support. Although her lawyer suggested taking him to court for non-payment, the woman did not wish to do this. As part of the divorce settlement, she was awarded a very old and not very reliable car. One Friday night, as she was driving home from work, it was raining very hard and most intersections were flooded. She was about a mile from her home when she stopped at a stop sign. A truck coming toward her from the opposite direction went through the intersection, spraying a great deal of water as he drove past. The engine of the woman's car died and she was unable to start it again. She removed her shoes before stepping out of her car as the water was more than an ankles deep. She raised the hood and began to dry off the distributor cap with her handkerchief. She was crying at this point and her tears mingled with the rain. She finally got her car started and managed to get home to her children. She realized that it was necessary to have a dependable car if she was to work and support her children. She had no money for a down payment on a newer car and she did not earn enough to make car payments. She went to work the following Monday and a co-worker asked her to go to lunch. The co-worker had just purchased a new Pontiac Tempest and insisted that Mrs. CD drive her new car back to the office. Although Mrs. CD protested that she did not wish to drive someone's new car, she did get behind the wheel and drove back to work. While she was driving the new car, she captured the feelings that this was her car and she felt the thrill of owning it. For the rest of the week, while she drove back and forth to work in her old car, Mrs. CD imagined that she was driving a brand new car of her own. The next Friday, Mrs. CD's ex-husband called and asked if she would like to have a new car. This was the first time since their divorce several months earlier that he had offered to do anything for her, including paying child support. The ex-husband was now working for a new car dealership and told her that as a salesman he was eligible to buy a certain makeup of car for no money down and with very low monthly payments. He said he was willing to make the monthly payments in lieu of child support and asked her to come to the dealership to pick out the color she wanted. It just so happened that the make of car eligible for this special deal was a Pontiac Tempest, the same make and model as the car she had driven that belonged to her co-worker. Mrs. CD was able to obtain through her use of imagination what she would never have obtained through her own efforts at that time. Her ex-husband, who had offered her no monetary support for months, was the avenue chosen to provide her with the car she needed. This is the story of Mrs. EF, who had a desire to live near the ocean and used her imagination to fulfill her desire. She did not wish to sell her present home but wanted to lease it for a year before making the decision to move it to the beach permanently. Mrs. EF told two of her friends about her wish. One friend, who had used the principle of imagination, told Mrs. EF that she would imagine visiting her at the beach in her new home. 1 week later, Mrs. EF traveled to Hawaii for a scheduled vacation. While there, she received a call from a friend who lived in San Diego. This friend told Mrs. EF that a perfect little house had just come on the market as a year-round rental and she thought this house would be perfect for Mrs. EF. Her friend also said that this was a very desirable rental and that Mrs. EF would need to make a decision immediately as the rental would very likely not be available when she returned from Hawaii. Mrs. EF told her friend to tell the owners that she would take it, trusting her friend's recommendation. Upon Mrs. EF's return from Hawaii, she told her grown daughter that she had decided to rent a house at the beach in San Diego. Her daughter called her later that day and said that the mother of a friend of hers wanted to lease a house. The woman came by the next day, said she loved the house and would like to lease it for a year. Mrs. EF gave notice at work and was able to move within a month. Since she was a nurse, she had no trouble finding a wonderful new job at a nearby hospital. Mrs. EF has since bought a house near the ocean and has spent 17 happy years living at the beach. Mrs. EF imagined that she was living at the beach and her friend imagined that she was visiting her there. They did this for 1 week. It is interesting that while she was on vacation in Hawaii, events moved swiftly to bring about her desire. She did nothing to find a new home, nor did she do anything to rent her present home. Imagination was able to draw the necessary people into her life so that her wish could be fulfilled. What should be done after we have imagined our wish fulfilled? Nothing. You think you can do something, you want to do something, but actually you can do nothing to bring it about. God, our own wonderful human imagination, knows what things are necessary to bring about our desires. It is only necessary to go to the end to live in the end. My ways are past finding out. My ways are higher than your ways. If we trust our imagination, it will accomplish all that we ask of it. Imagination can do all things. Have faith in it, and nothing shall be impossible to you. This story concerns a young man referred to as EP who was a wonderful athlete and was good at many different sports. During this particular time in his life, he became interested in paddling outrigger canoes. He joined a team and was soon competing in local races. In his second year of pursuing the sport, he was on a team that competed in the 50-mile race from Molokai to Honolulu. The Hawaiian outrigger teams usually took first place and were considered unbeatable. EP's team came in seventh, and that was considered quite remarkable considering the great number of teams that competed from all over the world along with the Hawaiian participants. After this race, EP began imagining that his team had won the race. He spent the next year forming a new team, practicing and building his own outrigger canoe. He was convinced that if he imagined himself winning the race, his team would come in first. Next year, his team, and at least a dozen others flew to Hawaii from Southern California to compete in the annual race. There were several teams with much more experience who were considered likely to place in the top 10. Although the Hawaiians were still considered the favorites, at the end of the race, EP's team finished first, ahead of the Hawaiians and all the other teams. EP now holds a paddle engraved with the words World Champion, which was given to him upon his team taking first place. After winning the coveted title, this young man went on to coach other teams. He also began manufacturing paddle for outrigger canoes. His paddles are known throughout the world and are used by outrigger teams who are among the top teams in the world. EP now makes his home in Hawaii and enjoys coaching teams, manufacturing paddles, fishing and sailing his own boat. He also uses his boat as an escort craft for the annual outrigger races. Mrs. JK was living in her twin sister's home after having been divorced. Mrs. JK had 3 children, a son and boy twins. Her sister and her husband had 3 boys. Needless to say, this was a crowded household. Mrs. JK was very desirous of getting married and living in her own home. She had been dating a man but decided that she did not wish to continue with the relationship and broke it off. Many of her friends attempted to fix Mrs. JK up with eligible men they knew, but she was not interested in going on blind dates. Several of her friends commented that if she wished to meet an eligible man, she would need to get out and go places. The twins believed in the creative power of imagination, and they had a friend who also knew of the power of imagining. The 3 women determined that they would imagine a ring on Mrs. JK's finger, which would imply that she was married. They did this for several weeks. During this time, Mrs. JK also imagined herself living in her own home. However, when she attempted to do so, she found herself imagining a home exactly like her sister's. One day, Mrs. JK received a call from a friend who asked her to come to her home and help her wallpaper her kitchen. Mrs. JK agreed to help her friend who lived a few blocks away in the same tract of homes. While she was there, a male neighbor came to visit her friend. The friend introduced Mrs. JK to her neighbor. He later called Mrs. JK and they began to date. 5 months later, Mrs. JK married this man. The interesting part of the story is that all of these people lived in the same tract of homes. There were only 4 homes in the tract of 1200 that had the same floor plan. Yes, this woman's husband owned one of the homes that had the same floor plan as Mrs. JK's twin sister. Even though Mrs. JK imagined herself living in her own home, she had only been able to imagine herself living in a house identical to her sister's. This is a story about the friend Mrs. LM who had introduced Mrs. JK to her new husband. During their friendship, Mrs. JK had tried to explain the principle of imagination to her friend, who was very doubtful that it would work. One day, Mrs. JK asked her friend to come to one of Neville's lectures. Mrs. LM agreed to attend, but was not at all convinced that imagining she had what she wanted would result in obtaining it. But she decided to imagine a very simple thing: the receipt of a handkerchief. She imagined that someone had given her one and then dropped the whole idea. Much to her surprise, she received a handkerchief in the mail from the mother of a friend who came to her house for lunch while she was in town for a visit. This woman sent Mrs. LM a handkerchief with a thank you note. Mrs. LM was not only surprised when she received the gift, she became very frightened as she thought there was something supernatural about it. Mrs. LM had attempted to disprove that this imagination produces the thing desired. When she received the handkerchief she had imagined, she interpreted it to be some sort of black magic and didn't want to know any more about this teaching. I could relate hundreds of incidents involving dozens of people in which imagination was used to bring about the desired results. I have chosen a few stories to illustrate that imagination can be used to solve all manner of problems and bring into your experience your every heart's desires.